Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going to journey into a part of history that is often overlooked in the history books, yet it claimed more lives than many of the great wars we study in school. We are stepping onto a battlefield where there were no medals for bravery, no songs written about the fallen, and where the enemy was biology itself. But before we arm ourselves for this journey, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy these deep dives into the darker, grittier side of history, the side they didn't teach you in school, please take a second right now to hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this video to more history lovers. And if you haven't already, make sure you are subscribed and have that notification bell turned on so you never miss an upload. We have a lot of dark territory to cover in this series, and you won't want to miss a single episode. Now, settle in, maybe turn off the lights, and let's transport ourselves back to the year 1300. I want you to picture a medieval battlefield. It's easy to conjure up the image: the mud, the chaos, the deafening clash of steel, and the screams of men fighting for their king. You see a knight charging into the fray. He is terrified, certainly. But look closely at him. He is encased in 40 pounds of tempered steel armor. He holds a shield of solid oak reinforced with iron. He wields a sword to defend himself. And if he falls, he has a squire to drag him to safety and a battlefield surgeon to stitch his wounds. He is a warrior, prepared for death, but he is equipped for survival. Now, let the noise of the battle fade. Cut to a quiet, drafty bedroom in a cold stone castle, or perhaps a humble cottage in a rural village. There is no mud here. There are no enemy armies screaming war cries. There is just a young woman lying on a straw mattress. She is not wearing armor. She is wearing a thin linen shift that offers no protection against what is coming. She has no shield. She has no sword. Her only weapon is a wooden stick to bite down on when the pain becomes unbearable. And yet, statistically, this woman is facing a probability of death that rivals, and in some cases exceeds, that of the knight on the field. Welcome to the true front line of the Middle Ages. We often talk about history as a series of conquests and kings, as if the only blood spilled that mattered was shed by the sword. But for half the population, the defining event of their lives wasn't a battle, it was a birth. Childbirth in the medieval world wasn't a medical event to be managed, it was a mortal crisis to be survived. It was a coin toss with the grim reaper, where the wager was your life, and the prize was the future of the human race. This is the story of the battlefield where no men were allowed to tread, and where survival was nothing short of a miracle. To understand the sheer terror of medieval childbirth, we have to start at the very beginning, the moment of realization. In the modern world, a positive pregnancy test is usually a moment of celebration. There are tears of happiness, plans for nurseries, and dreams of the future. But in the Middle Ages, the realization that you were pregnant often brought a very different emotion: pure, cold dread. There were no chemical tests, of course. A medieval woman relied on the cessation of her flowers or menstrual cycle, and eventually the quickening, that flutter of life around the 4th or 5th month when the baby began to move. But by the time she felt that flutter, the clock had already started ticking on a 9-month countdown that she could not stop, pause, or escape. Why was the fear so palpable? Because death was not an abstract concept. It was a neighbor. Every woman in a medieval village knew someone, a sister, a mother, a best friend, who had walked into the birthing chamber and never walked out. The statistics are harrowing to consider. Historians estimate that in some periods, 1 in 3 women would die during their childbearing years. That is a staggering number. It doesn't mean 1 in 3 births ended in death, but rather that the cumulative risk of having 6, 7, or 10 children meant that eventually the odds would turn against you. It was a game of Russian roulette, where the chamber was spun every 18 months. For a young girl, perhaps married off at 14 or 15, pregnancy was the end of her youth and the beginning of her trial. She knew that her body, which was often malnourished and physically immature, was about to undergo a trauma that even the strongest men would never experience. And unlike the knight who could choose to flee the battlefield if his courage failed him, a pregnant woman had no retreat. Once the child was conceived, it had to come out, one way or another. The realization of pregnancy was, for many, the signing of a potential death warrant. This fear was so ingrained in the culture that it birthed a specific, chilling set of rituals. Today, a pregnant woman prepares a nursery, buys clothes, and reads books on parenting. In the Middle Ages, she prepared her soul. As the delivery date approached, it was common practice for women to make their will. This is a detail that truly drives home the reality of the situation. Imagine being 20 years old, healthy, walking around, and full of life, yet sitting down with a scribe or a priest to dictate who should get your best dress, your silver spoon, and your few pieces of jewelry, because you genuinely believe you will not be alive next week. This wasn't just pessimism, it was spiritual pragmatism. The medieval world was deeply, terrifyingly religious. The only thing worse than dying was dying with a heavy soul. Women feared dying in childbirth, not just because of the physical pain, but because of the spiritual danger. If a woman died in the middle of labor, screaming in agony, cursing her pain, or overwhelmed by despair, she might die unshriven, without confessing her sins. She might die with the sin of wrath on her lips. This meant she could face purgatory, or even hell. So, the months leading up to birth were a time of intense spiritual cleansing. They visited shrines. They bought indulgences from the church. They prayed obsessively to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. The legend of Saint Margaret is itself a window into their fears. Legend had it that Margaret was swallowed whole by a dragon. Inside the belly of the beast, she made the sign of the cross, and the dragon's stomach burst open, allowing her to escape unharmed. It is a violent, graphic metaphor, but you can see why pregnant women clung to it. They felt like they were in the belly of a beast, trapped and waiting for a miraculous, violent escape. So, if it was so dangerous, why did they do it? Why did women endure pregnancy after pregnancy, often burying half the children they bore, knowing that each one could be their last? The answer lies in the brutal structure of medieval society. You were not an individual in the Middle Ages, you were a link in a chain. For the peasantry, children were the workforce. You needed sons to plow the fields and daughters to spin the wool. Without children, you would starve in your old age. A barren womb was an economic disaster. But for the nobility, the pressure was even more crushing. It was about the bloodline, the dynasty. A noblewoman's primary and often only job was to produce a male heir. A queen who failed to give the king a son was considered a failure, no matter how intelligent, beautiful, or politically savvy she was. We all know the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, but we rarely look at it through the lens of the terrifying pressure of childbirth. 2 of his wives, Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr, died from complications related to childbirth. Take Jane Seymour. She finally gave Henry the son he craved, the future Edward VI. But the cost was her life. She died just 12 days after the birth from puerperal fever, an infection of the womb. The king got his heir, the queen got a grave. And in the eyes of the court and the king, that was considered a successful trade. Her life was the currency used to purchase the future of the dynasty. This pressure meant that women were often forced into pregnancy before their bodies were ready, and kept in a cycle of pregnancy until their bodies collapsed. A girl married at 12 or 13 might be pregnant by 14. Her pelvis might not be fully developed. Her nutrition, often lacking in calcium and vitamins, meant her bones were soft. This brings us to a horrific medical reality of the time: rickets. In a world without fortified milk or sufficient sunlight, especially for noble women who were kept indoors to preserve their pale complexions, vitamin D deficiency was rampant. This caused rickets, which could deform the skeletal structure, specifically narrowing the pelvic inlet. For a woman with a rickets deformed pelvis, natural childbirth was physically impossible. The baby simply would not fit through the bone structure. But in an age before C-sections were survivable, there was no solution. She would labor for days, the baby's head grinding against her own bones, until she died of exhaustion, a ruptured uterus, or infection. Her own skeleton became the trap that killed her. And where were the doctors during this crisis? This is the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. In the medieval mind, childbirth was women's business. It was beneath the dignity of a university-educated male physician to look at a woman's private parts. Male doctors dealt with the high-minded theory of the four humors, with astrology, and with bloodletting. They did not deal with the messy, bloody, visceral reality of birth. So, when a woman went into labor, she didn't call a doctor. She called the midwife. Now, we must be careful not to demonize the medieval midwife. Many were wise, experienced women who knew more about the female body than any male doctor of the time. They used massage, herbal remedies, and psychological support to help women through the ordeal. But they were operating in a total void of scientific knowledge. They had no concept of germs. They didn't know that washing their hands was crucial. They didn't have antibiotics to treat the infections that so often followed birth. They didn't have oxytocin to stop the hemorrhaging that claimed so many lives. And perhaps most terrifying of all, they didn't have anesthesia. Think about that for a moment. The pain of childbirth is legendary even in the modern world, with epidurals and spinal blocks and nitrous oxide. Now imagine it with nothing but a cup of strong ale, a piece of leather to bite on, and the fervent hope that you would pass out before the pain became too much to bear. If the baby was in a bad position, a breech birth where the feet come first, or a transverse lie where the baby is sideways, the midwife couldn't perform surgery. She could only try to manipulate the baby with her hands, reaching inside the mother without sterilization, or resort to desperate measures that we can barely stomach to think about today. The pregnant woman knew all of this. She knew the stories of the neighbor who bled to death. She knew the stories of the queen who died of fever. She knew that the doctors wouldn't come, and that the prayers might not be answered. And yet, she had to walk forward. As the months ticked by and her belly grew, she was a soldier marching toward a battle she could not avoid. This was the death sentence hanging over every marriage bed. The knowledge that the act of creating life was inextricably linked to the risk of losing it. As the 9th month approached, the woman would look at her swollen abdomen not just with love, but with a profound, quiet terror. She was carrying her future, but she might also be carrying her executioner. And when the first pangs of labor finally began, usually in the dead of night, the time for worrying was over. The time for the will writing was over. The time for praying to Saint Margaret was over. The confinement was about to begin. The windows would be shut, the doors would be locked, and the woman would step into the darkness of the lying-in chamber, leaving the world of men behind to fight for her life in the shadows. But what happened inside that sealed room? That is where we will go next. The will has been written, the prayers have been whispered to the saints, and the husband has said his awkward, terrified goodbyes. Now, the heavy wooden door of the bedchamber swings shut, and the iron latch clicks into place with a sound that echoes like a prison sentence. For the next 4 to 6 weeks, this room will become a fortress, a sanctuary, and a separate kingdom where the laws of men no longer apply. In the modern world, a pregnant woman might work up until the day her water breaks, driving her car, going to the grocery store, and living in the bright, open world. But in the Middle Ages, the approach to the final month of pregnancy was radically different. It was defined by a ritual known as the lying in, or the confinement. To the outside observer, it might have looked like a luxury, a month of rest in bed while servants attended to your every need. But if you were to step inside that room, you would find that the reality was far more suffocating, a claustrophobic world of shadows designed by superstition and fear. The first thing that would hit you upon entering the lying-in chamber was the darkness. Medieval medical theory, combined with deep-rooted folklore, held that light was dangerous to both a newborn and a laboring mother. They believed that a baby's eyes were too weak to handle the sun, and that bright light could damage the mother's humors, causing her to become agitated, feverish, or mentally unstable. So, the order was given to seal it up. Heavy tapestries were hung over every wall and window. In wealthy households, these were thick wool or velvet, designed to block out not just the sunlight, but every single draft of fresh air. They believed that cold air was a carrier of disease, a miasma that could enter the womb and cause complications. The prevailing wisdom was that a laboring woman needed to be kept sweating hot to open the pores and facilitate the birth. Imagine the atmosphere inside that room. It is perhaps midsummer, hot outside, but inside the chamber the windows are nailed shut. Heavy blankets cover the walls, and a fire is roaring in the hearth 24 hours a day. The room becomes a sauna. Oxygen levels drop. Carbon dioxide rises. The air becomes heavy with the smell of beeswax candles, burning herbs, and unwashed bodies. In this stifling, artificial twilight, the woman would lie in bed, waiting. The lack of natural light messed with her circadian rhythms, leading to insomnia and depression, while the lack of fresh air created a perfect incubator for bacteria. They thought they were protecting the mother from the elements. In reality, they were weakening her immune system right before the most physically demanding event of her life. But the darkness served another purpose beyond the medical. It was a shield against the evil eye. Medieval people believed that demons, witches, and jealous spirits were envious of new life. By hiding the mother in the dark, they hoped to make her invisible to the supernatural predators that hunted in the daylight. Once the door was sealed, a strict social law came into effect. No men allowed. This is one of the rare moments in medieval history where the patriarchy was completely suspended. The king of the castle had no authority here. The husband, the father, the brothers, they were all banished. Even male doctors, on the rare occasions they were consulted, often had to shout advice from outside the door, or wait in the hallway, forbidden to cross the threshold. Inside the chamber, it was a matriarchy. The woman was attended by her gossips. Now, we need to reclaim the word gossip. Today, It is a dismissive term for someone who spreads rumors. But in the Middle Ages, gossip came from the Old English godsib, meaning god-sibling. These were the woman's close female friends, sisters, mothers, and the midwife. They were her spiritual relatives, her support network, and her army. For a medieval woman, who spent her entire life under the legal and social control of fathers and husbands, the lying-in chamber was a rare taste of absolute freedom. Here, she was the center of the universe. She was served the best food available. She was exempt from household chores. She could speak freely with her friends without male oversight. Visual depictions of these chambers show women drinking wine, eating rich foods, and laughing together. It was a female sanctuary. But this exclusion of men also had a dark side. It meant that if something went wrong medically, the male experts, the surgeons who might wield the instruments to save a life, were not on hand. They had to be fetched, and often, by the time they were allowed in, it was too late. The husband's role during this month was purely symbolic. He was expected to pray. In some cultures, there was even a practice called kuvad, where the father would mimic the pains of labor or lie in bed himself, a sympathetic ritual believed to distract demons away from the real mother. But mostly, he just paced the hallway, useless and afraid, while the gossips took charge of the fortress. Inside the chamber, the gossips had one main job: to fatten the mother up. They knew, instinctively, that birth required immense energy, comparable to running a marathon. So, the lying-in period was a time of forced feasting. The diet of a noblewoman in confinement was incredibly rich and potentially dangerous. She was fed groaning cake, a dense, nutrient-rich fruitcake named after the groans of labor, and vast quantities of meat based on the belief that blood builds blood. But the staple of the confinement diet was caudle. Caudle was the Gatorade of the Middle Ages, but much stronger. It was a thick, warm soup made from wine or ale, mixed with milk, eggs, sugar, and spices like saffron and cinnamon. It was packed with calories, but it was also alcoholic. Keeping a pregnant woman slightly buzzed was seen as medicinal. It kept her calm, kept her warm, and dulled the aches of pregnancy. However, consider the physiological reality. In a room with no ventilation, lying in bed for weeks with zero exercise, eating a high-fat, high-sugar, high-alcohol diet, many women developed terrible complications before labor even started. Blood clots, or deep vein thrombosis, were a real risk. Constipation was rampant. They were physically bulking up for a fight, but the training method was destroying their conditioning. And amidst the eating and the drinking, the conversation in the room would inevitably turn to the one subject everyone was thinking about, but trying not to say: death. The gossips would share stories. They would whisper about the neighbor who died last week, or the baker's wife whose baby came feet first. This wasn't meant to be cruel. It was their way of processing the collective trauma of their gender. But for the woman lying in the bed, listening to these horror stories in the dark, the psychological tension must have been unbearable. She was lying in the waiting room of the executioner, listening to stories about the axe. As the days ticked by and the due date approached, the room was transformed from a bedroom into a spiritual bunker. Since they couldn't rely on medicine to save them, they relied on magic and religion. The walls of the lying-in chamber were often decorated with religious relics. A wealthy woman might rent a relic from the local monastery, a finger bone of a saint, a piece of the Virgin Mary's girdle, or a scrap of cloth from a holy robe. These items were hung on the bedposts like spiritual lightning rods, intended to ground the room against evil. Amulets were placed everywhere. Eagle stones, or atites, were particularly prized. These were naturally occurring hollow stones with a smaller stone rattling inside, symbolizing the baby in the womb. They were tied to the woman's thigh to keep the baby in during pregnancy, and then moved to her breast during labor to draw the baby out. But perhaps the most fascinating ritual was the prohibition of knots. This is a prime example of sympathetic magic. In the lying-in chamber, you would never see a closed lock, a tied knot, or a crossed leg. Servants would go around the house unlocking chests, opening doors, and untying ribbons. The belief was that any blockage in the physical environment would cause a blockage in the birth canal. If a door was locked, the womb would lock. So the woman lay there, loose-haired with no braids allowed, wearing loose clothing, in a house where every cupboard was flung open, praying that the sympathetic magic would work and the baby would slip out as easily as an open drawer. They also used birth girdles. These were long rolls of parchment or silk, inscribed with prayers and incantations, which were wrapped around the woman's belly. Some of these girdles were ancient, passed down through generations, stained with the sweat and blood of grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had survived the ordeal. Wrapping yourself in one was like putting on spiritual armor, a tangible connection to the women who had fought this battle before and won. Finally, after weeks of darkness, heat, gossip, and fear, the moment arrives. It usually starts at night. A tightening in the abdomen, a sharp intake of breath. The woman freezes. The gossips stop their chatter mid-sentence. Is this it? Or is it just a false alarm? She waits. 10 minutes later, it comes again. Stronger, deep in the bones. The atmosphere in the room shifts instantly. The boredom of the confinement evaporates, replaced by a frantic, military-grade mobilization. The midwife is summoned from her sleep. The fire is stoked higher until the heat is nearly unbearable. The water is put on to boil, not for sterilization, as they knew nothing of germs, but for washing and warming. The groaning cheese is cut. The caudle is heated up. The woman is pulled out of bed. Unlike the modern image of giving birth lying on one's back, medieval women rarely gave birth lying down. That is a later invention. She is encouraged to walk, to pace the floor of her small, dark kingdom, using gravity to help the process. Outside the door, the husband hears the commotion. He hears the hurried footsteps, the hushed commands, and then the first true cry of pain. He knows that the waiting is over. The month of silence is broken. He will now go to the chapel to pray, for that is all he can do. Inside the room, the woman grips the bedpost. She looks at the midwife, the general of this female army. She looks at the amulets hanging on the wall. She looks at the darkness pressing in from the corners. The 9-month march is over. The enemy is at the gates. The confinement has ended, and the battle has begun. But now that the labor has started, what tools does the midwife actually have to help her? What happens when things go wrong? In the next part of our journey, we will open the midwife's toolkit and explore the bizarre, brutal, and sometimes deadly techniques used to drag a child into the world when nature refuses to cooperate. The first contraction has ripped through the silence of the lying-in chamber. The water is boiling, the fire is roaring, and the gossips have taken their positions. But now, all eyes turn to one woman. She is not a doctor. She has never stepped foot inside a university. She cannot read Latin, and she likely cannot write her own name. Yet in this room, she holds more power than the Pope. She is the midwife. And as the labor intensifies, she opens her kit. To the modern eye, the contents of a medieval midwife's toolkit would look less like medical equipment and more like the inventory of a witch's pantry or a scavenging crow's nest. There are no forceps, no stethoscopes, no sterile gloves, and certainly no monitors beeping in the background. Instead, there are stones, roots, vials of oil, scraps of parchment, and perhaps a few rusted iron hooks wrapped in a rag. This was the arsenal available to fight the most dangerous biological event in a woman's life. To understand what happens next, we must first understand the philosophy of pain. In a modern hospital, the first question a nurse might ask is, "What is your pain plan?" We have epidurals, spinal blocks, and nitrous oxide. We view pain as a problem to be solved. The medieval world viewed pain as a penalty to be paid. According to Christian doctrine, the agony of childbirth was the direct result of the fall of man. In the book of Genesis, God punishes Eve for eating the forbidden fruit by saying, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children." Therefore, the pain wasn't just a biological side effect, it was divine justice. It was Eve's curse. This theological framework created a terrifying dilemma for the midwife. If she did too much to relieve the pain, she might be seen as interfering with God's will. However, she was also a woman, often a mother herself, watching another woman scream in agony. So, a quiet, underground tradition of pain management emerged, a mix of herbalism and desperation. The midwife might reach for a vial of dwale. This was a primitive anesthetic, a potent and dangerous cocktail used in the Middle Ages. The recipe sounds like a potion from a dark fairy tale. Take the gall of a boar, hemlock, opium, henbane, and vinegar. Mix them with wine. Henbane and hemlock are deadly poisons. Opium is a powerful narcotic. If the midwife got the dosage right, the mother might drift into a groggy, semi-conscious state, the edge of the pain dulled. If she got the dosage wrong, the mother would simply stop breathing. It was a high-stakes gamble. Was the pain bad enough to risk killing the patient to stop it? More often, the midwife relied on safer, less effective methods. Heavy amounts of ale or wine to keep the mother drunk, or warm poultices of artemisia and mugwort placed on the belly, believed to relax the womb. But the midwife's most important tool wasn't a drug. It was a piece of furniture. If you walked into a medieval birthing chamber, you wouldn't see a hospital bed with stirrups. You would see the birthing stool. This was a low, horseshoe-shaped wooden chair with the seat cut out. Medieval women knew instinctively that gravity was their friend. Lying flat on your back, as became common in later centuries for the convenience of male doctors, actually fights against gravity and narrows the pelvis. The medieval peasant woman, in her wisdom, squatted. The midwife would sit on a low stool in front of the mother, waiting to catch the child, while the gossips, the female friends and relatives, would stand behind and beside the mother, physically holding her up, rubbing her back, and shouting encouragement. It was a team sport. The room was loud, sweaty, and intensely physical. However, labor does not always go according to plan. What happened when the contractions slowed down? What happened when the baby refused to descend? This is where the science of the Middle Ages descends into what we would consider torture or madness. The midwife operated on the principle that the baby needed to be coaxed or forced out. If labor stalled, the first tactic was the shake. The gossips would grab the laboring woman by the shoulders and physically shake her, hoping to jar the baby loose like a coin stuck in a vending machine. If that didn't work, They might pick her up and drop her gently onto the bed. This wasn't cruelty, it was physics, or at least their understanding of it. They were trying to use mechanical force to dislodge the obstruction. If shaking failed, they turned to the sneeze. The midwife might take a pinch of black pepper or a mixture of powdered hellebore and blow it into the mother's nose, or tickle her nostrils with a goose feather. The logic was that the violent convulsion of a sneeze would force the abdominal muscles to contract, pushing the baby down. Imagine being in the throes of transition, the most painful part of labor, and having someone blow pepper up your nose to make you sneeze uncontrollably. It sounds ridiculous, but it was a standard medical procedure. And if the sneeze failed, they turned to the supernatural. The midwife would reach into her bag for her lapidary, her collection of stones. The most prized was the eagle stone, or etites. We mentioned this in the previous episode, but its use during active labor was specific. The stone, which rattled when shaken, was believed to have a magnetic pull on the fetus. During pregnancy, it was tied to the arm or thigh to pull the baby up and keep it in. But now, in the crisis of stalled labor, the midwife would frantically untie it and strap it to the mother's inner thigh. The belief was that the stone would magnetically attract the child, drawing it down the birth canal. They might also place a magnet, lodestone, in the woman's hand or on her head, believing the iron in the blood would react to it. As the hours dragged into days, because labors often lasted for days, the atmosphere in the room would shift from frantic energy to terrified exhaustion. The fire would burn low. The mother's screams would turn to whimpers. This is when the midwife would deploy her textual amulets. These were strips of parchment with holy words written on them. She might place a parchment with the names of the 3 wise men, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, on the mother's belly. Why the 3 wise men? Because they were travelers. The hope was that just as they traveled to Bethlehem, the child would travel into the world. In extreme cases, if the mother was fading, the midwife might wash an old religious manuscript in water and force the mother to drink the ink-stained liquid, literally consuming the Word of God in a desperate bid for salvation. But we must look at the physical reality of the midwife's hands. Hygiene was non-existent. There was no concept of bacteria. The midwife might have come straight from tending to a sick animal, or preparing a chicken for dinner, or even laying out a corpse. She would wipe her hands on her apron, an apron stiff with the blood and fluids of a dozen previous births, and then reach inside the mother to check the dilation or position of the baby. They used oil to lubricate the passage, oil of lilies or violets, or sometimes just animal fat. This oil, sitting in an open bowl in a hot room, was a breeding ground for pathogens. Every examination, every attempt to help, introduced millions of deadly bacteria directly into the womb. This was the invisible killer. The mother might survive the birth, only to be struck down 3 days later by childbed fever, her body consumed by the very infection introduced by the hands that tried to save her. Let's imagine the baby is finally crowning. The head appears. The room erupts in shouts. The midwife's job now is to catch. She might have a bowl of warm wine ready to wash the baby. She might have a piece of thread to tie the umbilical cord. But she also has a knife. Not a surgical scalpel, but a household knife, sharpened on a stone. She cuts the cord. If the baby cries, there is relief. But often, after a long, traumatic labor, the baby is silent, blue, limp. In a modern hospital, a team of pediatricians would rush in with oxygen and suction. In the medieval chamber, the midwife had to act alone. She might sprinkle cold water on the baby. She might blow into its mouth, or, following ancient folklore, she might place the still warm placenta, the afterbirth, on the baby's chest, believing the remaining life force in the organ would flow into the child. But there is a darker tool in the kit, one we have not yet touched. What happens if the baby doesn't come? What happens if the baby is stuck? What happens if the head is too big, or the arm comes out first, locking the body in the pelvis? The midwife has tried the shaking. She has tried the pepper. She has tried the eagle stone. She has tried the prayers. The mother is losing consciousness. The baby has stopped moving. The room goes silent. The gossips stop their chanting and start weeping. The midwife looks at her kit. She pushes aside the oils and the stones. She reaches for the bottom of the bag, for a cloth bundle that clinks with the sound of heavy metal. She unfolds it to reveal instruments that look like they belong in a dungeon, not a nursery. Sharp hooks, serrated knives, crushers. She hopes she never has to use them. She prays to Saint Margaret that she never has to use them. But she knows that sometimes, to save the mother, the child must be sacrificed. Or sometimes, when all hope is lost, her job changes from bringing life into the world to removing death from the womb. The labor has stalled. The baby is trapped. And the battlefield is about to turn into a butchery. In the next part of our series, we will face the most horrific reality of medieval childbirth: the destructive delivery. We will see what happens when the midwife puts down the prayers and picks up the iron hooks. Warning: the next chapter is not for the faint of heart. The candles in the lying-in chamber have burned down to stubs, replaced again and again over the last 48 hours. The fire in the hearth has turned to embers, casting long, flickering shadows against the tapestries that seal the room from the outside world. The gossips, the chorus of women who have been chanting prayers and offering encouragement, have fallen into a terrified silence. The mother, exhausted beyond the point of screaming, lies limp on the birthing stool or the bloody mattress. She has nothing left to give. The midwife stands between her legs, her hands stained and trembling. She knows the truth that no one wants to speak. The baby is not coming. The shaking didn't work. The sneezing powder didn't work. The eagle stone tied to the thigh didn't work. The prayers to Saint Margaret have gone unanswered. The baby is stuck. Perhaps it is a breech birth with the head trapped, or a transverse lie where the shoulder is wedged against the pelvis. Or perhaps the mother's bones, deformed by rickets, are simply too narrow to let life pass through. We have reached the stalemate. In the modern world, this is the moment a team of surgeons would whisk the mother away for an emergency C-section, saving both lives in a matter of minutes. In the Middle Ages, this was the moment the birthing chamber transformed from a place of hope into a torture chamber. The midwife has to make a choice, or rather, the choice has been made for her by biology. The baby cannot be born. And if it stays inside, both mother and child will die. So the midwife puts away the oils and the amulets. She reaches into the bottom of her bag and pulls out the cloth bundle that clinks with the sound of cold iron. She unfolds it to reveal the tools of last resort: the sharp hooks, the serrated knives, and the crushers. These are not medical instruments designed to heal. They are instruments designed to dismantle. This is the grim reality of embryotomy or destructive delivery. It is a procedure so gruesome that even seasoned historical scholars flinch when reading the manuals. The goal is no longer to deliver a child. The goal is to extract the obstruction to save the mother's life. The midwife has to explain this to the mother, if she is even conscious enough to understand. She has to explain that the baby she has carried for 9 months, the baby she has felt kicking, the baby she has already named in her heart, is likely dead or dying, and that to save herself, she must allow the midwife to do the unthinkable. The psychological horror of this moment is impossible to overstate. The mother must lie still and endure the most invasive, violent assault on her body, knowing that the result will not be a cry of life, but a silence of death. The procedure itself was brutal and required immense physical strength. Without anesthesia, the midwife would use the hooks to grip the fetus. If the head was stuck, she might have to use a cranioclast to collapse the skull. If the arm was protruding, she might have to remove it. I will spare you the most graphic details, but understand this: it was butchery, performed in the dark, by touch alone, on a screaming woman who was held down by her weeping friends. The trauma inflicted on the mother's body was catastrophic. Even if she survived the blood loss and the shock, the internal damage, tears, lacerations, and fistulas would often leave her incontinent or permanently disabled, leading to a life of social ostracization and shame. She would survive the birth, but she would be ruined by it. But what if the situation was reversed? What if the mother died during labor, but the baby was still inside? This brings us to one of the most persistent myths of medieval history, the caesarean section. We have all heard the story that Julius Caesar was born this way, hence the name. But in the medieval world, this is almost certainly a linguistic error. Caesarean likely comes from the Latin caedere, meaning to cut. The truth is, in the Middle Ages, a C-section was not a surgery for the living. It was a surgery for the dead. It was physically impossible for a woman to survive a C-section in the 1300s. The shock of having her abdomen sliced open without anesthesia, combined with the inevitable massive hemorrhage and the guaranteed infection that would follow in a non-sterile environment, meant it was a death sentence. There are practically no recorded cases of a mother surviving the procedure until the very late 1500s or 1600s, and even then, they were miraculous anomalies. So why did they do it? Why would a midwife or a surgeon take a knife to the belly of a woman who had just taken her last breath? The answer lies not in medicine, but in religion. The driving force was the terrified belief in limbo. The Catholic Church taught that every human being was born with original sin. To enter heaven, that sin had to be washed away through the sacrament of baptism. If a baby died unbaptized, it could not enter heaven. It would not go to hell, but it would be trapped forever in limbo, a place of eternal suspension, separated from God. For a medieval parent, this was a fate worse than death. They could accept losing their child for a lifetime, but they could not accept losing their child for eternity. This created a frantic, macabre race against time, known as the post-mortem caesarean. Church law was explicit. If a pregnant woman died, the baby must be extracted immediately. Not to save its life, though that was a faint hope, but to save its soul. Midwives were legally and spiritually obligated to have a razor or a knife ready. The moment the mother stopped breathing, the midwife had to act. There was no time to mourn. There was no time to close her eyes or wash her body. Every second the mother was dead, the baby was suffocating. Imagine the scene in that candle-lit room. The mother has just passed away, after days of agony. The husband is weeping in the hallway, but the midwife cannot stop. She must suppress her own grief and horror, and immediately cut open the woman she has just spent days trying to save. She slices through the layers of skin and muscle, reaching into the womb to pull out the silent blue infant. And then comes the most heartbreaking ritual of all: the conditional baptism. The midwife, holding the limp body of the child, would sprinkle water on it and say, "If you are alive, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." She didn't know if the baby was alive. Often it wasn't. But if there was even a flicker of a heartbeat, a single gasp of air, the sacrament was valid. The baby's soul was saved. It could be buried in consecrated ground. It could go to heaven. The operation was a medical failure, but a theological success. The aftermath of these tragedies was a landscape of devastation. If the mother survived a destructive delivery, she faced the risk of vesicovaginal fistula, a hole between the birth canal and the bladder caused by the prolonged pressure of the baby's head or the midwife's tools. In a world without corrective surgery, this meant the woman would constantly leak urine. She would smell. Her skin would burn and ulcerate. She would be a pariah, often abandoned by her husband and shunned by her village. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and returned, but she had left a part of herself behind. And for the midwife, the psychological toll must have been crushing. She was the one who had to wield the hook. She was the one who had to cut the corpse. She was the one who had to tell the father that both his wife and his heir were gone. We often think of medieval people as hardened to death, but the records show us their grief. We see it in the diaries, in the court records where midwives defend their actions, and in the desperate prayers inscribed on the birth girdles. They knew they were fighting a war they couldn't win. But let's assume the miracle happens. Let's assume the shaking worked, or the eagle stone worked, or the baby was small enough to slip through. The head crowns, the shoulders rotate. The baby slides out into the midwife's hands, slippery and warm. A cry pierces the air, the most beautiful sound in the world. The mother, exhausted but euphoric, hears her child. The gossips cheer. The wine is poured. The husband is called in from the hallway to see his heir. They think the battle is over. They think they have won. They wash the baby, swaddle it tight, and place it in the cradle. They wash the mother, give her fresh linens, and feed her strong broth. The room is filled with laughter and relief. But they are wrong. The war isn't over. In fact, the most dangerous assassin has not yet struck. It is hiding in the room with them right now. It is on the sheets. It is in the water bowl. It is on the very hands of the midwife who just delivered the child. It is invisible, it is silent, and it is patient. The mother feels fine today. She will feel fine tomorrow. But on the third day, she will wake up with a chill, a slight fever, a pain in her belly. She will think it is just part of the recovery. She doesn't know that a microscopic enemy has invaded her body through the open wound of the womb. This is the silent killer. Puerperal fever, childbed fever. It killed more women in history than any weapon ever invented. And in the Middle Ages, they had absolutely no idea what it was, how to stop it, or the tragic irony that they were the ones giving it to each other. In the next episode, we will watch as the victory of birth turns into the tragedy of infection, and explore why the doctor was often the most dangerous person in the room. The screaming has stopped. The lying-in chamber, once a chaotic arena of shouting gossips and frantic activity, has settled into a peaceful, warm twilight. The battle is won. The baby, a son perhaps, to the great relief of the father waiting outside, is swaddled tightly in linen bands and sleeping in a wooden cradle by the fire. The mother, pale and exhausted, has been washed with warm water and wine. She has been fed a strengthening broth. She is alive. For the family, this is the moment of ultimate victory. The danger of the birth itself, the hooks, the breech presentation, the hemorrhaging, has been navigated successfully. The midwife is paid her fee and hailed as a hero. The husband goes to the chapel to offer a prayer of thanksgiving. They believe the danger has passed. They believe the mother is safe. But they are tragically, horrifyingly wrong. Because while the visible war is over, a microscopic invasion has just begun. The mother has survived the battlefield, but she is about to be assassinated in the recovery tent. There is a killer in the room with them right now. It is invisible. It is silent. And it has already planted the seeds of death deep inside the mother's body. This is the story of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, the scourge that claimed the lives of queens and peasants alike, turning the joy of birth into a funeral within days. To understand why this killer was so effective, we have to look at the medieval birthing environment through the lens of modern science, something they obviously couldn't do. The uterus after childbirth is essentially a massive open internal wound. It is raw, vulnerable, and the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. In a modern hospital, everything that touches a woman during labor is sterilized. Doctors wear gloves. Instruments are autoclaved. The air is filtered. In the medieval chamber, the concept of sterile did not exist. In fact, the environment was designed to be cozy, which inadvertently made it deadly. Remember the midwife's toolkit from our previous episode? The pot of oil used to lubricate the birth canal. That oil sat in an open bowl, warm and stagnant, collecting dust and bacteria for hours. The midwife's hands? She may have wiped them on her apron, an apron stiff with the fluids of a dozen previous births, before reaching inside the mother to check the baby's progress. The sponges used to wipe the mother's brow or clean her blood? They were rinsed in a bucket of warm water that had been sitting out all day. Every time the midwife performed an examination, every time she tried to help by stretching the cervix or guiding the head, she was unwittingly introducing millions of deadly bacteria, usually streptococcus, directly into the womb. The irony is heartbreaking. The more attentive the midwife was, the more she intervened to help, the more likely she was to kill the patient. Wealthy women often had higher mortality rates from fever than peasant women, because they could afford more care, more examinations, and more people in the room touching them. But the horror of childbed fever lies in its timing. It is a slow burn tragedy. For the first 24 to 48 hours after the birth, the mother usually feels fine. She is tired, sore, but happy. She holds her baby. She receives visitors. The relief in the household is palpable. Then comes the third day. This was the day midwives feared most. It usually starts innocuously. The mother complains of a headache. She feels a little chilly, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. She asks for another blanket. The gossips think it's just a draft. They tuck her in tighter. But the chill doesn't go away. It turns into a rigor, a violent, uncontrollable shivering that shakes the entire bed. Her teeth chatter so hard she can't speak. Then, the spike comes. Her temperature rockets upward. Her pulse races. Her abdomen, which should be healing, becomes distended and agonizingly tender to the touch. The bacteria have multiplied. They have entered the bloodstream. The body is going into septic shock. The medieval understanding of this process was completely wrong, which led to treatments that were not only useless, but actively harmful. They didn't know about bacteria, so they blamed the only things they understood: Milk and miasma. The most common theory was that the mother's milk had somehow curdled or gone astray. They believed that breast milk was actually transformed menstrual blood, a theory dating back to Aristotle. If the flow of milk to the breasts was blocked, they thought it backed up, flowed into the body, and corrupted the organs, causing the fever. They called it milk fever. This diagnosis was tragic because it shifted the focus away from the infection in the womb. Alternatively, they blamed suppression of the lochia. After birth, the body expels blood and tissue, lochia. If this stopped too early, they believed the poisonous blood was trapped inside, rising to the heart and brain. Or they blamed the air. Remember the confinement ritual of sealing the room? By trapping the stale, hot air inside with the mother, they believed they were keeping bad air out. In reality, they were creating a petri dish that concentrated the infection. So, how did they treat this dying woman? With brutality disguised as medicine. If they believed the bad blood was trapped inside, the logic was to get it out. So, they bled her. Imagine a woman who has just lost a pint or more of blood giving birth, who is weak, dehydrated, and fighting a massive infection. The barber surgeon is called in to open a vein in her arm or foot and drain more blood. This weakened the body's defenses further, accelerating the sepsis. They would force her to drink vile potions designed to provoke the flow. Mixtures of strong herbs, wine, and sometimes urine. They would apply hot poultices of cow dung and vinegar to her belly, hoping to draw out the poison, but effectively placing filth on top of a surgical site. The mother, delirious with fever, hallucinating from the toxins in her blood, would be subjected to these tortures in her final hours. The progression of puerperal fever is gruesome. As the infection spreads, the organs begin to fail. The mother's skin turns gray or mottled. Her breath becomes foul-smelling, a scent described in medical texts as cadaverous or earthy. It is the smell of the body decomposing while the person is still alive. She slips into delirium. She might not recognize her husband or her baby. She might thrash violently, requiring the gossips to hold her down. And this didn't just happen to the poor. It happened to the highest women in the land. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, is the most famous example. She gave the king the son he had destroyed the church to get. The delivery was long and difficult, but she survived it. The king was ecstatic. Bonfires were lit in London. Letters were sent across Europe announcing the happy news. Then, a few days later, the Queen felt a chill. The doctors argued. They bled her. They fed her rich wines. Within 12 days, she was dead. The most protected, pampered, and medically attended woman in England was killed by an invisible speck of dirt. Her death changed the course of history, leaving the young Prince Edward motherless and Henry VIII broken. Elizabeth of York, the mother of Henry VIII, met the same fate. She died on her 37th birthday, 9 days after giving birth. The recurrence of this tragedy across generations of royal women underscores that no amount of gold could buy protection from ignorance. The psychological impact of a death from childbed fever was devastating for the survivors. It happened so quickly. The house went from a nursery to a morgue in the span of a week. The father was left with a screaming newborn who needed milk. Since formula didn't exist, he had to find a wet nurse immediately, or the baby would follow the mother to the grave within days. This high maternal mortality rate fundamentally shaped the structure of the medieval family. It is the reason why the wicked stepmother is such a common trope in fairy tales like Cinderella or Snow White. These weren't just stories. they were reflections of demographic reality. Men who lost their wives in childbirth remarried quickly, not out of callousness, but out of necessity. They needed someone to run the household and raise the surviving child. A medieval child often grew up with a stepmother because their biological mother had been claimed by the battlefield of birth. As the mother lay dying, the atmosphere in the room would shift from medical panic to spiritual urgency. The priest would be called back. The extreme unction, last rites, would be administered. The candles that had been lit for the birth were now used for the death vigil. The tragedy was absolute. The mother had fulfilled her duty to society. She had produced the heir. She had paid the blood tax. But she would not be there to see the child grow. She would be a name in a family Bible, a portrait on a wall, a ghost haunting the stories of her descendants. But for the baby left behind, the danger wasn't over. The mother was gone, but the child still had to face the first and most critical hurdle of its existence. In a world where infant mortality hovered around 30 to 50%, the survival of the newborn was far from guaranteed. And for the medieval parent, the death of a baby carried a weight far heavier than just grief. It carried the terrifying possibility of eternal damnation. The baby was breathing, yes, but was its soul safe? This brings us to the final, frantic chapter of our journey, the race for the font. In the next episode, we will explore the baptism run, the desperate lengths parents and midwives went to ensuring their children were saved from limbo, and the legacy of a world where life was so fragile that you had to name a baby the second it took its first breath. The fire in the lying-in chamber has finally burned down to embers. The gossips have gone home to their own families. The midwife has packed away her hooks, her oils, and her amulets, leaving the house with her payment in hand. In the corner of the room, in a simple wooden cradle, lies the prize that was won at such a terrible cost: a newborn baby. It is swaddled so tightly in linen bands that it looks like a miniature mummy, a practice believed to ensure its limbs would grow straight. The house is quiet now. If the mother survived the fever, she is sleeping the sleep of the dead. If she did not, the house is in mourning, the mirrors draped in black cloth. But regardless of the mother's fate, the eyes of the father and the surviving family members are now fixed intensely, almost obsessively, on the chest of the infant. Is it rising? Is it falling? Is the breath rattling? Is the skin turning blue? We have spent the last 5 episodes exploring the war for the mother's life. Now, in this final chapter, we must face the war for the baby's soul. To understand the panic that defined the first hours of a medieval life, we have to look at the statistics. Infant mortality in the Middle Ages was not a tragedy. It was a norm. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that roughly 30 to 50% of children would not live to see their 5th birthday. The first year of life was the deadliest, and the first week was the deadliest part of that year. A newborn was a candle flame in a hurricane. They died from weakness, from cold, from infection, from dehydration, and from the very swaddling clothes that were supposed to protect them. But for the medieval parent, the death of a child carried a weight that is almost impossible for the modern secular mind to comprehend. Today, the death of a baby is a heartbreaking loss of potential, a theft of a future. In the Middle Ages, it was a theological catastrophe. The Catholic Church taught that every human being inherited the stain of original sin from Adam and Eve. This sin was a spiritual contamination that closed the gates of heaven. The only way to wash it away was through the sacrament of baptism. If a baby died after being baptized, the parents could grieve with hope. They believed their child was an innocent angel, playing at the feet of God, waiting to welcome them into paradise. But if a baby died before being baptized, that was the nightmare. The unbaptized infant could not enter heaven. It was not wicked enough for hell, so it was sent to limbo, limbus infantium. This was a place of eternal suspension on the edge of hell. The souls there did not suffer fire or torture, but they were denied the beatific vision, the sight of God. They were lost, forgotten, separated from their families for all of eternity. This belief created a culture of frantic urgency. A birth wasn't just a medical event, it was a spiritual emergency. The moment the baby's head crowned, the clock started ticking on its soul. This is why the midwife was given special powers by the church. In a normal situation, only a priest could perform a baptism. But in the birthing chamber, where death hovered in every corner, the church granted the midwife the authority to perform an emergency baptism. If the baby looked weak, blue, or silent, the midwife wouldn't wait for the cord to be cut. She wouldn't wait for the placenta. She would call for water immediately. It didn't have to be holy water. Rainwater, well water, or even water from a drinking cup would do. She would splash it on the child, sometimes while it was still half inside the mother, and recite the formula. I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. This simple act was a legal and spiritual document. If the baby died 10 seconds later, it was saved. It could be buried in the churchyard. It could go to heaven. But this emergency ritual led to some bizarre and tragic situations. Midwives were instructed that if a baby was stuck and only a hand or a foot was visible, they should baptize the limb. It was a desperate attempt to claim even a piece of the child for God. If the baby seemed healthy, however, the baptism run began. This was a physical race to the church. The father would not wait for a convenient Sunday. He would not wait for a family gathering. He would wrap the child up and run, often within hours of birth, to the local priest. Godparents were summoned hastily from whoever was available nearby. The fear of limbo was so strong that parents would brave snowstorms, rain, and the dark of night to get their newborn to the font. Tragically, this exposure to the harsh elements often caused the very illness they were trying to outrun. A baby might survive the birth only to die of pneumonia caught on the way to its own baptism. Inside the church, the ritual was stark and intense. The baby was met at the church door. It was not allowed inside until the initial exorcism was performed. Yes, an exorcism. The priest would blow into the baby's face to drive out Satan. He would place salt in the baby's mouth as a symbol of wisdom and preservation. Then they would proceed to the font. In the early Middle Ages, baptism wasn't a polite sprinkle of water. It was total immersion. The baby was dipped 3 times into the cold stone font. In winter, the water might be freezing. The shock alone could be dangerous for a fragile newborn. And then came the naming. In the modern world, we spend months choosing unique names for our children. In the Middle Ages, naming was a recycling process. Because mortality was so high, parents often reused the names of their dead children. If your first son, John, died at 3 months old, your next son would also be named John. And if he died, the third son would be John. It wasn't the lack of creativity. It was a stubborn refusal to let death erase the name. They were determined that a John would survive to carry on the family legacy. Walking through a medieval village, you might find 3 brothers all named Thomas. Thomas the elder, Thomas the younger, and little Thomas. living testaments to the siblings who didn't make it. This cycle of birth, death, and baptism was the rhythm of medieval life. It was a grinder that chewed up women and children with terrifying efficiency. And yet, the most remarkable part of this story is not the death. It is the resilience. Despite the hooks, the fevers, the rickets, and the limbo, women kept walking into the lying-in chamber. They kept getting pregnant. They kept facing the darkness. When we look back at medieval history, we usually focus on the knights in their shining armor. We marvel at their courage in charging a line of pikes. But the knight fought for glory, for loot, or for a king. He fought with steel and shields. The medieval mother fought for the survival of the human race. She fought with nothing but her own body. She walked onto a battlefield where the mortality rate was higher than almost any war in history, and she did it again, and again, and again. Every single person alive today is the descendant of a woman who survived this ordeal. Your family tree is built on the spines of women who endured the confinement, who survived the midwife's tools, and who outran the fever. They are the silent veterans of history. We don't build statues to them. We don't sing songs about their bravery. But perhaps we should. As we close the book on the battlefield of birth, take a moment to look at the world around you with fresh eyes. We live in an age of miracles. We have epidurals that take away the pain. We have C-sections that save the mother and child in minutes. We have antibiotics that turn the deadly puerperal fever into a minor inconvenience. We have incubators for the premature. We have sterilized rooms and washed hands. We have conquered the monsters that hunted our ancestors in the dark. But let us never forget the price that was paid to get here. Let us never forget the groaning cake, the eagle stones, the baptismal fonts filled with ice-cold water, and the women who lay in the dark, biting on wooden spoons, praying for one more sunrise. This has been the story of the most dangerous journey a human being can take. The journey into life itself. Thank you for joining me on this 6-part odyssey into the shadows of medieval maternity. If you survived the hooks, the fever, and the fear of limbo, you are officially a part of this channel's history. I want to know what you think. Could you have survived a medieval birth? Or would you have taken your chances on the actual battlefield? Let me know in the comments below. If this series opened your eyes to the brutal reality of the past, please destroy that like button. Share this video with a friend who thinks history is boring, and make sure you are subscribed. We have explored the tavern, and we have survived the birth. But the Middle Ages has many more dark corners waiting for us. Perhaps next time we should visit the surgeon's table, or the dungeon of the Inquisition. Until then, stay safe, wash your hands, and be grateful for modern medicine.